I would say that grant funding is kind of like a great equalizer when you have clients and people saying no to things, and all of a sudden you find a funding source, then sometimes those things will start changing to yes, so that's really important. Okay, so next up, Kathy Garcia. Kathleen has been is the Planning and Community Development Director for the City of Del Mar. She's responsible for the development review, long-range planning, building department, code enforcement, and clean water program for the City of Del Mar. In addition to her municipal responsibilities, Kathleen teaches the sustainable planning course in the urban studies and planning program at UCSD. Prior to the City of Del Mar, Kathleen was a partner with WRT, a national planning and design firm, where she produced plans and designs for various civic, institutional, and community projects. Kathleen has held multiple civic appointments, including as planning commissioner for the City of San Diego for 8 years, design review board member for the UC Riverside, and her education includes a Bachelor of Arts in Landscape Architecture from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's from Harvard. Kathleen?
Thanks. Well, thanks very much for having me, and it's really wonderful to see a joint meeting between APA and ASLA because I can go to both, right, in one meeting. But it's also indicative of how important this topic is to all of us, because I've always had the opinion that planning and design are really pretty much the same. They're just dealing with different aspects of the same problem solving. Some are down in the detail level, other are up in the policy level, but it is, as I'm hoping my career is showing, it's easy to transgress between the two and move into the other side of it and really bring that knowledge to other parts of the decision-making process. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about how we go about developing a Green Streets policy. And how many of you in this room are actually on the policy side? So about a third, I'd say. Well, even if you're not developing policy, you're implementing it. And for all of you who are doing regular design work, you're implementing policy with every computer stroke or stroke of the pen you make, because policy really has everything to do with how we actually get things built. So in order to talk about the development of a Green Streets policy, I want to talk a little bit about the various different contexts that they can exist in, whether it's something that comes from the general plan, a climate action plan that a jurisdiction may have, or the water quality improvement plans, which, as Bob mentioned, were how each watershed implements the MS4 permits. I also want to talk a little bit about the key components of what kind of makes a strong policy, how the vision and intent can really set the stage, how we work with directives, that are very specific, and also implementation. And then conclude with talking about the measures of success, or the importance of measuring the success, because that's what will bring us to the next stage. So when we look at the policy, the context of the policy, we really have to focus on why is this right for the community. And when we look at Green Street policies that do exist right now, they actually form a very broad spectrum of communities and really respond to the particular nature of that community. In Tucson, it was looking at how the drinking water, the purity of the drinking water could be protected because they were finding the runoff from the streets were actually infringing on the drinking water. In Santa Ana, it's about recharging the groundwater. They're very concerned about how much the groundwater is being depleted and it's not being recharged, which is bringing brackish water back in up the Santa Ana River. So they're a very different objective. The actual solution may be the same, but the objective is different. And we in Del Mar are looking at it in order to protect our wonderful resources of the two lagoons and the ocean, where the entire city basically will erode and run off into those two natural resources. And I think if you think about every other city that you're working in, you'll see that the context may be slightly different. So the question to ask is, why is this right for that community? You'll find that a Green Street will could very well implement a climate action plan. We recently adopted one, and they required a complete streets policy, but then they had a number of other things to protect the drainage ways, and we tied those together into one policy that was addressing both complete streets and green streets, and hopefully we'll get it approved by council in 2 weeks, so stay tuned. But also looking back to how to implement some of the goals in the general plan, depending on when yours was last updated, and ours was actually written in 1975 by community members, and there's basically a will in the community never to update it. However, going back, I forget that I'm on camera, going back and looking at it, they had such foresight because they talked about traffic calming in the general plan in 1975. They talked about providing for the pedestrian as the highest priority of mobility. That kind of sounds like the same thing that we're all talking about under the guise of either a green street or a complete street. So maybe they didn't quite have the words of carbon sequestration, but there was definitely the intent, and green streets can be a wonderful way of increasing carbon sequestration right within the context of any capital improvement project. We also have the ability to reduce the heat island, which is causing a lot of impact into our climate change at the micro level, raising it 5 degrees, 6 degrees, just because of the amount of asphalt we have. And then implementing the watershed's Water Quality Improvement Plan, otherwise known as WQIPs in the acronym soup of drainage. But the need to find as many different ways that these can be implemented is extremely important. And every time you can either, as Bob suggested, get additional funding or bring it into the policy context of multiple different policies, there's a far better chance that the political world will actually move forward with something that has maybe some controversy, because as I've learned, everything has controversy. So what are some of the steps to building a new policy? First of all, determine how best, start off by determining what's the best vehicle for doing it. It really doesn't matter. I mean, maybe it should be a general plan amendment, and state law is encouraging it to be a general plan amendment. But sometimes you're in a context where amending your general plan isn't really necessary or isn't desired for other reasons. You could look at it as a straightforward ordinance, which is much more regulatory. It could be much more aspirational through some sort of master plan, or even as a city council policy. When you have policies that you can rely on, you can actually develop a city council policy that talks more to the procedures and the actions and still includes some of the aspiration, but kind of starts moving it forward to getting it done. And then if you look at a number of communities, they've actually done design manuals. It's kind of like putting the recipe out there. And what better way to talk to engineers than putting that recipe right there in front of them and say, this is standard practice, do it. In all cases, we need to look at how we adapt to the CEQA requirements. We could have the benefit of doing a program EIR. That will mean that all these actions as they move forward could actually roll into that EIR. In other cases, or in communities which every EIR is litigated, it may be best to do it at the capital improvement project level, because then you can talk to the specifics and really build that into it. So don't forget the CEQA requirements as you move forward in building a new policy. I always like to start a policy document with a vision and an intent. Because things change over time. And when you go back to the details, say 50 years later or 60 years later, the intent should stay the same, but the details may change. So if you have a strong vision and a strong intent as to what the community wants to achieve and how this really can improve the community and how we can lay out objectives to actually accomplish something, we can look at a policy that could have a lot more shelf life, a lot more longevity. And then establish that context. As I said at the beginning, what is very specific to that community? Is it the watershed objectives that a broader area of the community has? Make sure that those are really described in the context, because what's right for Del Mar won't be the same as what's right for San Diego. Different geologies, geographies, and different communities and community values. Make sure, oops, excuse me. That one does not go backwards, there. Make sure we state the consistency with other policies. Again, building on the policies that are already adopted will give any sort of green streets, which might mean mumbo jumbo to some policy makers, that this is something that really builds on direction that they're already going. And then make sure there's a strong section on how this policy is applied. Who's responsible? Because we all joke about the plan that sits on the desk or on the shelf, and that's not the objective. It's really trying to change a mindset. And Green Streets is changing a very different mindset in the community of how our circulation is utilized. We divided our policies into 7 areas. And the first one of those would really discuss the policy, or the processes and the procedures. In most jurisdictions, there's multiple departments, and those departments are really good and work to their objectives really well. And even when you're small, sometimes you just don't talk about it. And all of a sudden, you realize they went off on this direction, and we could have integrated something that we're trying to accomplish in planning. Or somebody in stormwater says, why didn't planning think of this? So it's really important to establish those processes and procedures right up front as how the different sections of a community will work together, and that includes public participation. And then to recognize that all streets aren't the same. There's really typologies of streets. Are arterials treated much differently than our collectors? Are our neighborhood streets at a whole different refinement? And then set your policies to respond to those street typologies. But much like in complete streets, the most important part of this is all to work with a network. This is about connections. One little standalone will have some benefit, but when you make 8 pieces that actually connect together, you can have a substantial benefit that really can affect a much greater whole. Design is something that, of course, dear to my heart, but important that we lay out the objectives for it. Not necessarily specifically how it is designed, unless there's something very particular. I mean, we have bluffs that are really impacted by coastal erosion, and so any sort of infiltration into those bluffs is very dangerous for the erosion. So we need to look at balancing those 2 different objectives in design, and that's something that's extremely important. And then talking about the implementation, how you go about bringing these objectives, these policy guidances into physical form is really important. One that is frequently missed, though, is interpretation and education. Because once again, we can preach to the choir, this room is the choir, but we are really working with a much broader audience. And this is up in the mid-coast community of Paso Robles in San Luis Obispo County, and there was a street that flooded on a regular basis every major rain that came down. And they implemented a green street to manage flood control. It also went directly into the Salinas River, which is a really interesting river in that it runs underground almost all year long, and you never see that the river's there. So they talked about why you don't see the river. Where is the water going? The water is actually flowing underground, and you don't know it's there. They did a number of interpretive things on the street corners, signage, but they also incorporated public art by using old methods of, or old tools that were used for grading and drainage into public art pieces, and they're actually used as bicycle racks. So something that's really important to kind of bridge that theoretical aspects of what is a green street into how it can actually mean something to your neighbors. And then nothing works unless we can assess how it is performing. So make sure any sort of policy has performance measures. They need to be quantifiable so that you can actually review them and see if you're meeting the objectives, and measurable so you know where you are. It's kind of how far did we jump? And then accountability. Accountable people are ones that respond, and we never really do things unless we know how we're either accountable or how far we've been able to reach. So bringing those two together in performance measures is extremely important for any sort of policy to actually have long-term benefit to your community. One of the early adapters was the city of Philadelphia, and they created an entire watershed program and a fabulous website if you need information. A lot of these graphics actually came from there. This website, phillywatersheds.org, but they made green streets a subset of a much larger program. Green parks, green schools, green vacant land. Amazing to think, when you have vacant land, that can be part of your whole stormwater management system. So suddenly streets weren't kind of singled out as the only ones that had to accomplish all these green principles that the city had adopted. It was part of a larger network, and therefore we had everybody thinking about it, from the people who were planning parks and schools to developers who were looking at vacant land and traffic engineers who were looking at the streets. And so they actually developed a very useful street design manual, too, that I think you'd find very helpful. But making all of these actions part of a much larger commitment can bring green streets into everything that we do. So thank you very much for your interest. And now let's hear from a couple of folks who have actually designed and built some green streets and how they're doing.